from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT. It's Hal Kempfer. We're going to have a little strategic risk assessment talk. And I don't know if this will be particularly controversial, but it may. I'm going to delve right into something, pulling on my experience of emergency preparedness, working at the, in uniform, working at the FEMA regional level and national level, and then out of uniform, working at the national, international level. I do a lot of stuff in the area of what's called Homeland Security, and emergency management obviously falls well within that spectrum. And I've done this over the many years. And I just say that going into this because some people are going to say, what's a war dog like Hal, the guy who talks about war in Ukraine and wars in the Middle East? Why is he talking about emergency preparedness? Well, you get involved in a lot of things. And towards the latter part of my military career, I got much more involved in a lot of domestic support, domestic military support or defense support of civil authorities, and did a lot of that. And essentially as a contractor, if you will, working for a variety of government DoD organizations, still do. And so anyway, I'm going to pull on that and talk about what everybody's been seeing in the news over the 4th of July weekend, which is the horrific tragedy of what happened in Kerr County in central Texas. And that's the flash floods that just swept down the Guadalupe River. And as of last count, it's getting close to 100. I think we're over 95. People have been reported killed, dead, deceased. And the real tragedy is, I think about 28 of them at this point are children that were killed. And there's still more children that are missing and others that are missing as well. So anyway, let's talk about what happened here. And maybe out of this, we can take something that might lead to lessening of these sorts of horrific things in the future. First, let me talk about what happened. Flash floods in Texas killed, as I mentioned, about over 95 people. The number just keeps jumping up and up and up. About 28 of them children. Left a lot of others still missing, including many young girls that were at this Christian camp called Camp Mystic. And it's a camp that's been up there in the hill country of central Texas for, I think, close to a century. A lot of luminaries have sent their children to this camp. It's very well known. I believe Laura Bush, George W. Bush's wife, was a counselor at that camp. So let's just say it's a very well-known summer camp that's in central Texas. The devastation was along the Guadalupe River, which is outside of San Antonio, and there's a massive federal, state, local volunteer search effort going on, and a lot of officials, locals especially, but even some federal with the National Weather Service are facing a lot of questions with the state and local, but more so on the local side. They're facing a lot of questions over preparedness and the speed of their initial actions. And this gets into local political leaders and making difficult decisions when you have imperfect information, you have the prospect of a threat from natural or man-made disaster, or a possible man-made or natural disaster in the future, and making timely, effective decisions that can save lives later on. It is one of the most difficult things. It is also something the Department of Homeland Security in its first decade was looking at very closely, and that's what I'm going to talk about. Some of the problems that led to why we are where we are today. Now, the hill country of central Texas and that central part of the state, especially in the summer, is naturally prone to flash flooding due to dry, dirt-packed areas where the very dry, dense soil lets rain basically skid along the surface instead of soaking in. And when you have a lot of rain that comes all at once, the water doesn't soak into the soil. It just kind of runs off it. And you end up with a big flash flood situation like you saw here. It's basically shooting across the surface of the landscape, and it was a really bad storm. I've seen places in central Texas where I think within 24 hours they got 20 inches of rain. I think that area up there north, which was upstream of the Guadalupe River, got a very compact 12 inches of rain in a very short period of time in the early morning hours. And that's what led to this massive flood stage. Now, there were alerts put out. There was a flood watch notice midday on Thursday. That's before the 4th of July. That's before the big flash floods hit in the wee hours of Friday morning, but there was a flash flood notice that was put out, but it just didn't seem to get a lot of action. It didn't seem to get the sort of thing that one hopes that it would have gotten, looking in retrospect with what happened. And then the National Weather Service issued a very urgent warning about 4 a.m. And honestly, when you look at it, if everybody had swung into action at 4 a.m., I'm sure a lot of people would still be alive today who aren't, that raised the prospect or potential of catastrophic damage and a severe threat to human life. So there were warnings out there. The problem wasn't, I know there's a lot of focus on the National Weather Service because of some DOGE-related cuts to the National Weather Service, and I'm sure they're going to be looking very, very closely. I'm sure Congress is going to be looking very closely at that. But from what I can tell right now, it really wasn't so much the National Weather Service. In fact, it appears that they may have actually had, in some places, more manning than they normally have, just in anticipation of some of the weather activity that was going on out there. And but at least by 5:20 a.m. That Friday morning, Kerrville City and the area in Kerr County along the Guadalupe River, say water levels were getting really high, and at points on the Guadalupe River, the flood stage or whatever, it had risen 26 feet. That's about 8 meters in about 45 minutes. I mean, it is absolutely a phenomenal rise in the amount of water. And keep in mind, this is happening at night. This is happening in the wee hours of the morning. This is happening it's happening around a girls' camp where the girls, the counselors were sound asleep. And from what I understand, that part of that camp is that they separate everyone from their cell phones. They want them to cut off from everything else that's going on outside. So they actually have them take away their cell phones. What that means, though, is when you send out alert, which makes that really annoying noise that you hear, for example, what we hear, I'm in Southern California, so what we heard with the Palisades fire and the Eaton fire, where it sent out these really loud alerts. Well, if you're away from your cell phones, the phone isn't right there. You know, depending on where the phone is kept, you may or may not hear it. And there were no sirens that were in those camps or along the Guadalupe River Basin in the area. And so for many people, they realized there was a flood when the water started coming into the cabins and the wall of water was hitting the cabins. All right. Camp Mystic, as I mentioned, is it's a Christian girls camp. Been there for a very long time, and it was very full with a lot of girls. One of the truly tragic things at camp, it's a tradition there, is that the younger girls, we're talking girls that are like 7, 8 years old or whatever. The youngest girls that stay at the camp are in the cabins that are at the lowest level. In other words, they're closer to the river. So what happened was as these flash floods moving down, it was first impacting the cabins with what are arguably, I would say, the most vulnerable population at that camp, which is these really young girls. And then it was, as they get older, they move into higher up the hill into cabins. So the older girls were actually in a better situation to try and escape, to evacuate or get out of there in time than the younger girls down at the bottom. And of course, this is all playing out in real time. And as you can well imagine, it's a pretty horrific situation. In 1987, the Guadalupe River, not too far from where this happened, also saw a 26-foot flooding event. It's not, I heard some stuff. I even heard President Trump say this was a once in a century or once in 100 years event. Technically, it's not once in 100 years. That area up there is prone to flash flooding, and that Guadalupe River Basin has had a flood similar to this. In that situation, it was a horrific event where the flood came down and hit a bus, and a lot of people were killed. And some people escaped and got up into trees. Very much similar to what you see here. And that was, that was a while back. I mean, it was 38 years ago, but it's not 100 years ago. And we're seeing more of these flood events on a regular basis. Climate change is real. Regardless of all the debates on what causes it, climate change is a real thing. And so we are seeing some of these more severe weather events. Now, let me go back to this. Kerrville, this little city that was there, and Kerr County, which is the county around it, they did not, at least as far as I know, that area did not have any audible sirens. These are sirens that you often have with tornadoes. You can do them for flash flooding. You can do them for tsunamis. These are public notice things. World War II, they used to have sirens like this to notify the public of potential air raids, like an air raid siren. Well, those weren't there. And apparently that had been recommended, talked about before, and the local officials say that local taxpayers didn't want to spend the money for these things. How much would these sirens cost? It depends. I've seen around $10,000 to $50,000 per siren. It's not an inexpensive thing to do, but obviously you can see if just one siren was operating at that Camp Mystic, it would have made an enormous amount of difference if they could have got that going in time. This was the reason. Now in Central Texas, in that general area, there are areas in the Central Texas Hill Country that do have these sirens, and they have them specifically because of the threat of flash flooding. And my understanding is that in those areas, it worked, from what I can tell. So it's not an unknown thing. It's not something that they aren't doing in Texas. It's just they weren't doing it in that local area. And that's going to get to the crux of what I'm going to talk about, which is local officials' decision-making on emergency preparedness and mitigation of potential disasters like we just saw here. Now, I got to tell you, personally, I would very much like to know who these local taxpayers were, what they were saying, how they were saying it, who they were saying, and exactly what they said. I kind of like to know that because the results of what they did beforehand have resulted in an incredibly tragic situation now. And I would really like to know who they are, and I would love to have the TV cameras go up to these local taxpayers or the officials that were listening to those local taxpayers. And after the response, when you go into the recovery phase, I want to see them get asked some very pointed questions. I would like to see them answer, tell me your rationale. Tell me your criteria. Tell me if what you did you think is worth the lives that were lost, the suffering that was incurred. Tell me if you think it's really worth that. And I'd like to hear what they have to say. And it's not because I'm being vindictive against them or angry. Well, I am angry that there's another tragic disaster like this that took place. But I would like to hear what they're saying. I'd like to hear the rationale, because that could be instructive to other leaders around the country when they come up and are facing similar types of questions. Cost-benefit analysis of putting some, mitigative steps into place that can save lives later on. Obviously, in this situation, the local officials, I'm going to just put it out there, they failed the test. All right, they didn't put it in, and a lot of people are now dead because of it. And a lot of them are children, and that's what emergency preparedness is about, is to prevent things like this from happening. Now, the challenge of emergency preparedness is that unlike response, which all first responders are very familiar with, in response, you get what's essentially called a call for service. Something is happening. Everybody gets in there, sometimes code 3 or whatever. They get in there with lights and sirens, and they're responding to an exigent situation. Okay, and everybody understands there is an ongoing exigent situation where they have to respond. That's not a difficult one to figure out. Mitigation, preparedness, doing those things well ahead of time when there is not that exigent situation, where there's only the possibility or the probability of an exigent situation. For those who deal with taxpayer monies, who manage those monies, who look at competing requirements, who are, who in many cases bend with the political winds, if you will, it's a more difficult thing for them to figure out. And for those who want them to spend that money on mitigation or emergency preparedness, it's a difficult sell. You have to have something very substantive, very concrete. By the way, there has to be an incredibly high level of trust and confidence in the source of the, quote, intelligence, unquote, the information they're getting in order to base those types of decisions. Unlike the response, those situations lack the sense of urgency that you have with an actual emergency situation. And the costs involved can be substantial. Hence, it's very easy for politicians to kick the can down the road, so to speak, to avoid making those decisions. And sad part is, sometimes, but more often than not, the repercussions of those who kick the can down the road are not felt by those who are actually doing the kicking. In many cases, people come in and they happen to be in those positions at the time. I have no doubt that the emergency managers in Kerr County, amongst many others, are going to eventually feel a lot of pressure because of what happened. We saw this certainly in Maui after the fires in Lahaina. We've seen it in a number of situations, but in many cases, yes, they were the decision makers when the event took place, but they were not necessarily the decision makers when the decision to kick the can down the road on a lot of things that could have made a big difference were in place. And I would certainly like to see that situation change. I'd like to see some go back and say, Okay, you were there then and you made this decision, and ask those types of questions. And again, not because I'm vindictive, but I think if every politician in the country realized that there are consequences for avoiding difficult decisions like this, they would be a little more thoughtful in making those types of decisions. Now, why does decision making by state and local leaders matter so much in this realm? In the end, I would say it's the most important factor in saving lives, preventing suffering, greater property loss, if you will, physical loss, damages, things like that. I think what we do in terms of shaping that decision-making environment, shaping those decisions, is probably the most important thing. I know a lot of times we look at just the assets. You look at, trucks, fire trucks, helicopters, all the other things that we need, more ambulances, more hospital space, and all of that is absolutely crucial. And certainly that's, part of preparedness as well. But the other part of it is looking at some other things that are maybe a little less apparent, a little less flashy, such as putting sirens in. It's tough to get a strong constituency going for sirens. It's tough to get a strong constituency going for building a flood wall. But these are absolutely crucial things. They cost money. They are investments. But shaping those decisions is absolutely crucial. Now, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, following on the heels of all the mistakes that were made prior to 9/11, looking at a number of other disasters and events that had happened around the country, emergencies, things like that, DHS was realizing, as was the White House under President Bush, realizing that there was a real problem. If you look at Hurricane Katrina, essentially that's what politically destroyed President Bush's second term. I mean, there was just a dramatic drop in public confidence with President Bush, and it really did. It's a cloud over his presidency that he's never been able to dispel, was how poorly he acted on that. And it's easy to focus on just the president, but you also have to look at what happened with, you have to look at what happened across the board with other things as well. And so I just kind of want to put that out there. DHS pushed a thing called Comprehensive Preparedness Guide, CPG 502, talking about this. It was pushed out. It actually went out in 2010 under Secretary Napolitano, but it was to basically create that decision-making environment for state and local leaders to make this happen. Now, within all that, there was money, FEMA grant money attached to it. There are folks that want to take that FEMA grant money and spend it on other things. There were folks, particularly in California, that had conflicts of interest. This was documented in a memo that was actually written by one of the directors of one of the DHS-sponsored intelligence fusion centers about all the conflict of interest problems, particularly in the California Department of Justice, tied to FEMA grant-funded programs. And this undermined not only California, but later that they actually told Texas, no, you can't implement CPG 502. And I would encourage anybody to look it up, to research it. There had been an ongoing effort in Los Angeles area to implement this guidance. And this was about making that decision-making environment, building a trusted source for the analysis, for the understanding that goes into making these difficult political decisions on making expenditures, and proactively putting in together plans for evacuating areas. And nobody wants to tell people to evacuate an area and then have them evacuate with all the trouble that incurs. And then there's no great threat that hits that area. Okay. I mean, it's great there's no great threat that hits that area, but then there's all the recriminations that you made everybody do this thing, and there was no big threat. And so they're always very sensitive to that. But what I will tell you is this, that when Texas wanted to put this in place, about a dozen or so years ago, they called California because California had tried to put this together in Los Angeles. And what I was told from Texas officials at the time in Central Texas was that they were told no, that they couldn't, that California claimed that they owned the curriculum, the workshop, curriculum, training, whatever you want to call it, that was necessary to put this into place. And because of the way they told them, they dropped it. I was also told a little bit later that Florida had that same problem, that they dropped as well. So they basically said, look, we're not going to mess with this. We're not going to deal with fight California, particularly then because, red versus blue, and I won't get into all that, but you can remember this is under the Obama administration, and that's California. And anyway, they just didn't want to deal with that political hassle, so they just kind of kicked the ball down the road. That is now in play. That is something there. By the way, when you invoke intellectual property rights like that, that is one of the tools, as I've been told by multiple intellectual property rights attorneys, that is one of the things that a state can do that can abrogate its sovereign state immunity protection under the 11th Amendment, because copyrights, patents, things like that, intellectual property is considered a private property right. It's not something that's considered part of the public domain, if you will, that a state normally invokes with sovereign state immunity, because first off, they're making some sort of profit off it, so they also incur the liability that goes with it. So I find that rather interesting. I think that's something they will explore as they're going forward looking at this, and also they're going to be looking at a number of other things, memos where these conflict of interest problems were brought up, and also digging into what's going on. And I'm not going to predict the future, but what I am saying is, having spent time in Austin working with Texas state authorities, I could easily see the Texas Rangers given a task to dig into something like this. And I could tell you, if you thought things were interesting in California now, wait till Texas Rangers start investigating California state officials. That would be rather fascinating. By the way, if you're wondering if this same sort of problem that is indirectly impacted what was going on in Texas also was a factor in what we saw in certainly Paradise in Northern California with what happened there. The Palisades fire, the Eaton fires, the mudslides in Montecito. Yes, that same thing did affect the leadership decisions at the time, some of the plans at the time that went with that, and certainly deserves a full review. And by full review probably means someone doing some investigating, possibly at the federal level, to find out exactly what happened. But there's certainly enough documentation out there to take a hard look at this stuff. And I am sure that California is not alone in doing stuff that has hindered this. And I'm sure they're going to look very closely at everything that was done in Texas. Anyway, much to consider. There's my very controversial thing I'm throwing out there. Thanks for listening to Strat. And please visit stratpodcast.com. You can go to my YouTube channel, Hal Kempfer TV. You can certainly go to my website for my company, GripSA, GRIPSA.com. And you can also go to stratpodcast.com for any of this. So anyway, thanks for listening to this, and there'll be a lot more going on as this horrible situation in Texas continues to roll out and we learn more of the tragic details.